Because the Chinese name is the other way around. So
Okay, Ritika, let us know.
Yes, ma'am, please start.
Well, a very good morning to everyone from New Delhi. On behalf of the Center for International Relations and Strategic Studies at Impact and Policy Research Institute, India, and RAND Center for Asia Pacific Policy, USA, I, Simi Mehta, welcome you to a very timely and relevant panel discussion on the Sino-Indian border standoff, background, and the way forward. We have a very vivid memory of the tensions between India and China in Doklam in the year 2017. This was followed by a period of normalcy, peace, and bilateral visits at the very highest levels and interactions from both sides. But the trend underlined by the summit meetings like the Chennai Connect and the Wuhan Spirit were again challenged in June 2020, when Chinese and Indian soldiers confronted each other in the disputed area on their western border in the area known as the Galwan River Valley. There is much that we know and much we do not know about the incident, with a lot of confusion caused by the politics of the situation. Economic ties have been affected. There is a need to understand the situation with a bipartisan view rather than get caught in a he said, she said situation mentality. To shed light on the background and the way forward in this standoff, we have with us a very eminent panel this morning. It is my delight to introduce to you our first guest, Professor Zhou, who's joining us from Beijing, China. Professor Zhou is a China Forum expert, former director of the Center for Security Cooperation in the Office for International Military Cooperation, Ministry of National Defense, where he is responsible for multilateral cooperation. He is also a senior fellow at the Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University. He started his military service in 1979, serving in various posts, including being the Chinese Defense Attaché to the Republic of Namibia. He is a regular commentator at the China Global Television Network on global security issues and has published more than 100 essays and opinions in English. Professor Zhou has been a PLA delegate at the Shangri-La Dialogues and at Munich security conferences. He is joined by his assistant, Ms. Dong Ting. Good morning.
good morning.
Good morning. Our second guest this morning is Professor Srikanth Kondapalli, who's calling in from New Delhi. He's professor in Chinese studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He was educated in Chinese language at Beijing Language and Culture University and was a postdoctoral visiting fellow at People's University, Beijing, where he received a PhD in Chinese studies. He has been a visiting professor at National Chengchi University, Taipei, at China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, Beijing, and an honorary professor at Shandong University, Jinan, at Jilin University, Changchun, and at Yunnan University of Finance and Economics, Kunming. He was also a Salzburg Global Seminar and the recipient of the K. Subramaniam Award for Excellence in Research and Research in Strategic and Security Studies. He has published extensively, including books, research articles, and media commentaries. Thank you, sir, for joining us this morning. And finally, we have Professor Rafiq Dosani, who's joining us from Santa Monica, California. Professor Dosani is the director of the RAND Center for Asia Pacific Policy, a senior economist at the RAND Corporation, and a professor at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. He works on education, regional development, security, finance, and technology issues. His recent research has been on the Belt and Road Initiative and modes of engagement with North Korea. Previously, Professor Dosani was the director of Stanford University's Center for South Asia and a senior research scholar at Stanford University's Institute for International Studies. He holds a PhD in finance from Northwestern University, an MBA from Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta, and a BA in economics from St. Stephen's College, New Delhi. In 2017, Professor Dosani received the Exemplary Performance Award from South Asian Studies Association for lifetime scholastic contributions to South Asian studies. Thank you, sir, for joining us. I invite Professor Dosani to offer his welcome remarks.
Thank you very much, Simi. It's a pleasure on behalf of the RAND Corporation and the RAND Center for Asia Pacific Policy to welcome all our audience to this important seminar. There are many such seminars going on these days on this topic. Many of them are just focused on one side or the other. We have them in the US as well. We thought it would be good to try and get two high-level panelists from one from India, one from China, to openly discuss the issues with the attempt to clarify the issues at stake. There's so many questions that are not answered or that we don't even understand, as Simi mentioned. For example, why was the issue dormant until now? There's been a long time since good relations have been there between India and China. In that spirit, India has resolved border disputes with Bangladesh about 5 years ago. China settled many countries' border disputes, for example, Russia in 1994, Tajikistan 1999. What's held back using the good period of relations to deal with some of the more sensitive issues? Second is, what initiatives were undertaken by different sides that appeared to be threats to the other side? And finally, is this the right time for a permanent resolution? So I hope that we'll be able to discuss at least some of these issues and look at this as a start of a conversation. So thank you again all for being there. It's our pleasure to co-host this event. Back to you, Simi.
Thank you, sir. So before we kick off the discussion for today, there are some housekeeping announcements. This discussion is being conducted according to the Chatham House rule. This means that the audience may use this information that they get through, but they may not cite the names of those who made the comments. We would record the session, but only for the purpose of creating a summary without attribution, and will delete the recording thereafter. And second, in the first round, each panelist will have 7 minutes each to offer their insights on the state of India's China relations. In the next round, we'll have an intra-panel discussion for around 10 minutes. And then finally, we'll have question and answers from the audience through the chat box for about 20 minutes before we wrap up with a vote of thanks. So I request the panelists to stick to the time, and I urge the audience to be precise in their questions, identify the panelist to whom the question is posed, and stay focused on brainstorming for a way forward amid the standoff. With this, I invite Professor Zhou to make his initial remarks. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Doctor, very much, and a very good morning from Beijing. Before I start, I wish to say that I have retired in late September. Therefore, I'm no longer an officer in active service in the Ministry of Defense, and I only wish to speak in my personal capacity as a senior fellow of Tsinghua University. Well, the accident occurred in June is most unfortunate, especially for someone who has been the staff officer for South Asia for 10 years. Over the past, we have heard remarks from both sides, especially from leadership, how over the last 4 decades, not a single bullet is fired across the border, which is true. And this is so comforting. But we had the deadly blow on the Himalaya mountains. Well, from the Chinese side, I would want to explain how Chinese believe this is triggered by the Indian side, because there is counter-argument from the Indian side. So this is not my focus. What I wish to say is that recently I combed through international media and found that, especially in Western media, there is an accusation of China making use of the pandemic to become more assertive and aggressive. This is certainly not true. Why? Because during the pandemic, China has provided assistance to more than 150 countries, the largest external assistance since the founding of PRC. There's no need for China to make use of such assistance to bully someone. This is not logical at all. The second thing is militarily, China it's hard to compare, but I would say, and I believe most people would agree, that China's military is not necessarily inferior to the Indian Army's military strength. Therefore, for China to make use of the pandemic for an advantage over India in the line of actual control, there's no such a need. And the fact that we didn't announce the casualty on Chinese side compared to India's public announcement shows some concern from the Chinese side not to give the media a chance to hype the tension. So this is a kind of consideration from the Chinese side. So talking about the issue, we probably need to look beyond the border issue, and that is a conclusion reached by the two sides since Rajiv Gandhi visited China in 1980s. So I think there is a different perspective of each other. In India, I don't know how people would think, but I do have read some Indian strategists comment that China would want to encircle India from the border and from the sea. I don't think so. I sometimes believe this is a kind of a self-praise in another way, because China's strategic focus is never on India before and after the war in 1962, partly because the United States has taken China as a primary strategic competitor. So China's strategic focus is how to confront, how to deal with such a competition, rather than focusing on India for any strategic gain. This doesn't make any sense. I'll give you an example. In 1998, India conducted a nuclear test with the excuse of China's threat. At that time, the situation between our two countries is peaceful. But I somehow understand why India would call China a threat, or potential threat number one, because at that time, India needed an excuse for such a nuclear test, which is not a small thing. So they need to find a big excuse. But that, anyway, was an excuse. In China's strategic calculation, India's position is certainly rising, in part because of its whole national strength, including military strength, is rising. So I just wonder whether that is reflected in the Indian military strategy, because the Doklam standoff in 2017 is an example. Even if India considered the territory is disputed, unlike China, which believes that Doklam is Chinese territory, India should have no reason to interfere, because even according to the India-Bhutanese Friendship Treaty, the two governments should cooperate closely with each other on issues related to the national interest. But that, however, is different from invitation, which is in the government has described by the Bhutanese side. Undoubtedly, there is such an invitation, actually. On that issue, I believe India has no reason to be involved at all. The other reason is that if we look at the current, the present and the future, China's Belt and Road Initiative have to pass through India, be it on land or in the Indian Ocean. Therefore, whether China's relation with India moves in a positive way or not really matter. In terms of Quad, I don't believe it is. Well, I believe it is because of China, at least, if it is not against China. But I personally believe it doesn't matter that much, because none of the four countries wish to sacrifice its bilateral relationship with China for the gain of other three countries. Talking about the border issue, I think the most difficult part is that we seem to have a total opposite position towards how this issue might be resolved. In that, Chinese thinking is top-down, that is to reach a kind of political consensus of mutual understanding and mutual accommodation before we make efforts to demarcate the line of actual control. And India's position seems to be bottom up. That is, we verify the line of actual control before we start to talk about any possible solutions. So, how many minutes left?
1 minute, please.
Okay, so the position is totally different, and over decades we haven't been able to resolve this. In China there is a fear that if we follow India's way, we verify the line of control, and India would say, so that's it, and then China would lose a large part of territory. So what should be what should be done? I have only a few proposals. First of all, some circumstances should each side fire either at the other side or even to the sky. This is what Indian did, to shoot in the sky to give alarm, because this would really raise tension and cause miscalculation. Second, we should reduce the frontline deployment of troops. This is against the current situation, but eventually we have to avoid this. Third, we should increase coordination of the soldiers at the forefront to avoid the confrontation. So far, the high-level military commanders meeting are very much appreciated, although they probably are not fully authorized to resolve the problems, because these problems are beyond the capability. And I believe we should really increase, set up the hotlines. This is possible, given that China has a set up hotline with most countries in its periphery, and even with the United States and Russia. And I know this has been discussed, but this has not been decided. But I think this would be the right direction. And after the crisis, I believe, in spite of the massive deployment of troops along the line of control, it won't be like this situation forever. But eventually, I think for the patrolling troops, they should keep distance. And the neighboring military region or commands should resume contacts after the crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll get back to you with questions. Thank you, Professor. I invite Professor Srikanth Kondapalli to make his remarks. So 7 minutes for you. So please unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mehta. Also to Dr. Rafiq Dosani and my fellow panelists, Mr. Taupo. The issues related to the territorial dispute and the situation that we have seen, China had stated and elevated that this issue has been it's sovereignty related. So for the first time, there has been some elevation in China's position on this count. It also had stated that the Ladakh Union Territory has been an illegal one, which means basically then the negotiations in this regard are not going to be very fruitful. Thirdly, there is the criticism from China on India building feeder lines from the Daulat Beg Oldi Darbuk Shiok road that has been constructed last year. So a feeder line that is to be built in June has been the eye of the storm. Although China had built such feeder lines for the last 2 decades. So India does not understand why China is objecting to the road construction because Chinese patrols can move to their perceived line of actual control at any time, at any given time, but refuses the Indian position to reach the line of actual control in the same manner. A fourth reason that has been mentioned for this trigger is the Chinese statements regarding the China-Pakistan economic corridor and the recent investments that China made in the sovereignty-related problem of Gilgit-Baltistan and Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. Indian leaders have criticized China's position, including in various fora. the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and other venues as well. And China has not explained why the investments have taken place in Gilgit-Baltistan, a disputed territory, a sovereign territory of India. The Chinese statement that these are commercial has not really convinced the Indian side, because there is an estimated 36,000 security guards that China deployed in these regions, which meant that, again, India has expressed its concerns on this. A fifth reason, China had suggested that the abrogation of Article 370 of the Indian Constitution, while the Indian side suggested this is a domestic affair, and India did not object to the 1965 reorganization of Tibet region, when China made that reorganization of provincial divisions. The Tibet Autonomous Region, Qinghai, and Amdo Kham regions have been integrated into Sichuan and Yunnan provinces at that time, but India did not object to. So India was surprised with the vehement position that China took on Article 370 abrogation, which is an internal matter of India. There was a suggestion, again, that the Home Minister Amit Shah's statement in the parliament on the recovery of Aksai Chin has been mentioned, although External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar clarified to the Chinese side that no borders have been changed with the speech that the Home Minister had made. I wanted to suggest that since 2005, Chinese statements mention Arunachal Pradesh as southern Tibet. At this logic, India did not go into Ningchi prefecture, occupied territories there, opposite to the Arunachal Pradesh region. So India was surprised when it had occupied vast tracts of land in Ladakh region, which is, of course, a disputed territory, but was surprised with the stridency that Chinese forces took. Chinese side also suggested that because US-India relations are improving, that China wants to teach a lesson to India on the foundational agreements that India had signed with the United States and the 2+2 dialogue process, or the Quad or other arrangements that have been made in the recent times. There is also the COVID-19. India was surprised when it is busy in February, March this year, busy with tackling COVID-19. There is a lockdown across the country. India was surprised with the urgency that China took in mobilizing forces in this region. So India thought that this is a kind of double whammy, the COVID-19 as well as China's aggression in Ladakh region. The other reasons mentioned were asymmetry in power relations, that China is showing its military might on India, conventional superiority. And so the Ladakh event, which resulted in the loss of 20 Indian soldiers on June 15th. There are other reasons.
Kondapalli, wrap up a minute.
Yes, India did not join the Belt and Road Initiative, or there are ambitions of the local generals like Chao Chung-chi in the Western Theater Command. There are resources, nationalism, competition over other areas. In terms of the way out, respecting the previous agreements and arrangements, the 93, 96, 2005, 2013 agreements is necessary. India is surprised why China had to mobilize 60,000 troops in the border areas in violation of the previous agreements. Secondly, the way out is disengagement and de-escalation in order to restore peace and tranquility on the border. China had suggested to meeting the halfway. However, since China had occupied some territory in this region, the meeting the halfway looks very spurious. There is also the suggestion made by some Chinese about the revival of November 1959 line by Premier Chou En-lai but that has been not acceptable to the Indian side, as is reflected in several agreements that they have signed before. There is a need for the line of actual control clarification, which is necessary in order to avoid such incidents in future. There is also a necessary, as the Xiamen BRICS meeting decided, to have new CBMs, confidence building measures. And it appears that if there is no resolution, and if these two civilized states cannot resolve their territorial dispute, it would be tempting on the part of any of these to go to the International Court of Arbitration for arbitration of the land under dispute. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Dosani, if you could provide your initial remarks. 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Simi. So from, I'll try and give my remarks more from an American point of view. From one thing that comes clear from an American point of view is that the question is being raised as to whether the US should be involved in any way in this dispute. I mean, the one way to look at it is that here are two highly mature, very strong politically, and there may not be rich countries and there might be economic disparity between them, but in terms of their political maturity, there's really no difference. So why is it that two very mature countries, which are large and powerful, cannot solve this issue on their own? There is in fact a sense in the US that India would like the US to be hawkish on China, despite the reality that it does not really need American help. So, that's something I'd like to raise. Maybe later on we can discuss this. Now, if you remember, President Trump was initially quite restrained in the early days of the incident, calling on both sides to bilaterally resolve the issue and offering to mediate if needed. Later on, Secretary of State Pompeo took a much harder line on China, and this, in fact, aggravated the Chinese stance, it seems. Now, how does it look like under the incoming administration of Biden? The general feeling is that Biden will be less unilateral. He'll be more multilateral in his approach. He may be less hawkish than the Trump administration, but it's not clear what that means. Does it mean he will accommodate China, or is he trying to create a multilateral group? He's talked about a summit of democracies to confront China, or at least contain it. So we need to really pass that because, despite President Trump's efforts, it looks like his tenure would be over in a month or so. The sense that I have, and it's just my view, is that, and to some extent furthered by Biden's focus on domestic issues, that he would not do anything until the pandemic is addressed, which is, as you know, is a big crisis in the US right now. Following that, he would be concerned with economic recovery. And that's, if you combine the pandemic issue addressed now that there is a vaccine, and it will be rolled out over the next 6-7 months, hopefully to cover the entire population. And then economic recovery follows in another 4 or 5 months. We're talking of at least a year during which the US will, in practice, do nothing. So it really then becomes really incumbent and important for China and India to say, we can solve this on our own. We don't want American intervention. I know that both sides are saying they don't want it, but in reality, there seems to be some feeling in the US that, in fact, India wants the US to be somewhat hawkish on China. So when I heard Professor Zhou and Srikanth, Professor Kondapalli's statements, it seems there's still a huge gap between the two sides, and this is something that that needs to be addressed. So with that, I'll end my comments, Simi, and hand it back to you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Dosani, for your brief remarks, yet points to ponder on. So we'll move on to the next bit of discussion in the panel. So Professor Zhou, my question to you is, if you could just reflect on Professor Kondapalli's remarks briefly, And also added to this is, in previous conflicting situations, there have been efforts on both sides to actually make serious efforts to delimit where the claim lines were, or even exchange of maps, etc. That happened regularly previously, but this has been aborted, unfortunately. What are your views on the immediate steps that India could take to bring tranquility along the border and also stability in the situation, so that this Galwan-like situation does not recur? And then I'll flip it to Professor Kondapalli also, so that he could give a thought in the moment Professor Zhou ends. Is that what, if you could reflect on Professor Bo's response and reflections, and also offer your thoughts on what China should do, to bring stability in the situation. So I would start with Professor Zhou, sorry. Please unmute yourself, Professor.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
2 to 3 minutes, please.
Yeah, thank you, Simi, for your question. Well, you're talking about the previous positive efforts of exchanging maps, which really happened. But unfortunately, it was aborted because the Chinese side consider in exchange of map on the western section, the Indian side actually has expanded the area of dispute. That means the Chinese side was surprised to find that the Indian map a more disputed area than Chinese map. So because we understand that there are disputes, but the Indians perceive the disputes much more than China's. So China believes India side want to make use of this opportunity of exchanging map to actually claim more territory from China. So we do not believe we are discussing line of actual control. We believe the Indian side has tabled Indians proposed the line of actual control. What could India do in the present unpleasant situation? That is a good question. I think some of the proposal have raised from the Chinese side. The Indians want to withdraw from the very region, which is Chinese believe a Chinese territory. But again, with them to come to the conundrum again, whose territory is it? Because this is the very root of the problem, because we have disputes as to which part is really Chinese and Indian territory. So the soldiers could end up patrolling or even stationing in areas taken by the other side to be their territory. Then, theoretically, if we demarcate the line of control, then this is the easiest way to solve the problem. But the Chinese believe that if we do this way, the Indians may say, look, this is how it is. Let's make it what it is. Then China would lose 90,000 square kilometers because of recognition of the status quo, because of the fact that the eastern section is, according to China, illegal. It is in line with my home line, something left by the British colonialist. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zhou. Professor Kondapalli, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mehta. I think we both agree, Professor Zhou and myself, on the line of actual control clarification as a crucial step in the dispute resolution between India and China. Over 36 years, as of now, the Indian side and Chinese side have discussed this. In 2002, they have stopped exchanging information about the maps in the special representative meetings and so on, according to the reports that we see in the open press, which suggests then that there has been a decision taken to not to process the LAC clarification. Although special representative meetings are meant for three-phase process, one is the guiding principles, second phase is in terms of the political discussion on the LAC clarification, and finally the third stage is to finally resolve the LAC definition. However, we have seen that 22 discussions have taken place in the special representative mechanism, and we do not see any progress. On the other hand, we also saw the Doklam crisis. We have also seen a host of other areas coming up for the dispute. But what is India's concern in the whole episode is why has been China more strident in this region? What has been the explanation from the Chinese side to be in such in an urgent manner, go and occupy territories which it considered as disputed? There is no explanation from the Chinese side. The External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, in the Lowy Institute discussion last week, mentioned about 5 reasons. I mentioned 15 reasons in terms of the Chinese press, Chinese Foreign Ministry, the Western Theater Command spokesperson's comments. All these included, for me, it appears some 15 reasons why China had undertaken what it had done in this. The stridency of the Chinese position was surprising. What is the current urgency for China to occupy so much? It's still a black box for India, although these 15 reasons could be some of the indicators. Nevertheless, at the moment, if you want to have peace and tranquility on the border, both sides should go back to the original positions that they have in April 2020, when the brawl has begun in Pankungso Lake, in Galwan Valley, in Gogra Heights, in the Depsang Plains, and other places. India's position is fair enough. It is trying to suggest that let us go back to the status quo of what existed before, and let us see how it goes in terms of the discussions between the two sides. The Chinese side is in possession of land in the disputed territory and is suggesting to a meeting midway, meaning occupying those territories and then trying to, this is not acceptable to India. And so despite the 8 discussions that we have had at the Corps Commander level, no progress has been achieved. And it is already 9 months since the issues have been boiling over in this. So for big countries like India and China, you have a huge gaping hole on the border in terms of tensions. That is more dangerous.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kondapalli. I now come to Professor Rafiq Dosani about if you could offer your views on the Belt and Road Initiative and also on the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and their implications on the Sino-Indian relations. If you could put it briefly.
Yeah, just a quick comment on both Professor Zhou and Professor Kondapalli's remarks. You know, it seems to me that we're still taking a very nationalistic view of things. It's as if each side is just saying, this is our position. That's not going to change anything. I'm just being a little provocative as sort of someone not directly as closely involved as both of you are, but I think we'll have to go beyond that. I mean, the larger scheme of things, X thousand square kilometers means nothing in terms of the relationships. And both China and India have demonstrated their ability to sacrifice land in return for peace repeatedly. So there's no logic behind saying that we can't sacrifice land for peace again. In some meaningful way that appears fair to both sides. I'm just raising that as something for us to think about. Let me turn to the Belt and Road Initiative. You know, it's a very large initiative. China has invested about 70 billion a year now for the last 5 or 6 years. And if you add in all the working capital loans and so on, it's probably well past $1 trillion right now. Pakistan is the centerpiece of the BRI in some ways. It's the country which is getting the single largest investment of all the BRI countries, 62 billion or so. And it's intended to be transformative for Pakistan, in the way that railway lines and power plants have, through the BRI, have transformed already smaller countries like Kenya, like Ecuador, even Kazakhstan, this is intended to be transformative for Pakistan. One piece of evidence, for example, is that Pakistan has moved from being chronically power deficit to being power surplus, entirely as a result of the BRI. So Pakistan is not going to give up on the BRI or the CPEC as it's called in Pakistan. Now, India's logic for not joining is that this is going to, as even Srikanth mentioned, this is going through territory that India claims. And China's response is it's commercial, once you decide whose it is, it'll go with whichever country agrees to have it, So now I'm not sure what the resolution of that is, but the reality is that for China, this is strategically important. I mean it in both senses, that, creating a stable, strong Pakistan, which is in everyone's interests, is accompanied by life.
Professor Dosani? Professor Dosani, could you check your connection? I think there is an issue. Ritika, am I audible?
Yes,
Yes, ma'am.
louder.
So let us have Professor Dosani back. In the meantime, you could continue once he is back. Professor Dosani, are you here? Okay, so there's some glitch. So never mind, we could have his comments again when he rejoins. So we'll now move on to the questions that we have received on email from the audience. And one question for Professor Zhou is that what is the everyday view of India among the Chinese? And what impacts do you think would a Biden administration have on China-India relations, and the ways in which it will inform Beijing's relationship with New Delhi going forward? And I will also club it with another question for you, Professor Zhou, is that, could you explain the Chinese government's decision-making process for handling border issues with India? And the Indian government's claims that in June 2019 incident, it was premeditated by China, which is a fact that is supported by commercial satellite imagery and public reporting, etc. So why did President Xi Jinping decide to confront India over this border issue at this point in time? This is a general feeling in India. If you could just put this to rest. Over to you.
Well,
briefly, Professor.
Yes, on the first question, it's very easy. China's connections with India, even at ordinary people's level, is increasing. We have flights, we have more Indian restaurants in China, and we Chinese even love the latest Indian films. So this kind of China has no hostility towards India. On Biden's possible role, my answer is I don't know. I pretty much agree with Dr. Dosani, because President Biden would be very much preoccupied with domestic affairs. So in terms of foreign policy, he could achieve very easily, for example, climate change, on Iranian nuclear issue, which is a bit more difficult because that's an assassination of the Iranian scientist. But I believe, yeah, well, I think India and the United States are getting closer more superficially. It won't, such kind of even military exchanges in information won't add much weight on Indian side. In terms of the Chinese government's decision on the line of actual control, I would argue still this is an accident, because President Modi's relationship with President Xi Jinping, it looks very much close. This is really a kind of a rapprochement. And at that time, the Chinese military of the regional command was doing some exercises, so we might have more people at that time. But again, this is what I said in the beginning. We in China believe that the Indian side actually has came across to the Chinese side, build a road, to build a bridge, and even trying to set up a tent. And they actually beat the Chinese soldier who went to dissuade them. This is the Chinese side of the story. So there's no change in Chinese government policy toward India. We are two largest developing countries. And people talk about 18th century. I don't want to use such a word like 18th century, but at least there is a genuine goodwill from China toward India in that you are our largest neighbor. And our strategic focus is not on India. There's no reason for China to become confrontational to India at a time when China was pulled into this kind of era of great power competition.
Sure, thank you so much. Professor Kondapalli, if you could share your thoughts on that. And also the question that has come up on the email is that if you could give us a sense of how are the border skirmishes affecting the domestic politics in India vis-a-vis China. There appears to be some sort of a unification. All sides of the politics are united, in their views to protect India's territory. So your views on that? Coupled with another question is that it is not just the borders where the two countries are at odds with each other. There is the South China Sea, and then there is an attempt to keep India from investing in different countries like Sudan, Nigeria, etc. So is this a zero-sum game? Is this kind of zero-sum game sustainable, or there could be more peaceful options for cooperation? Over to you.
Thank you. On the domestic situation, on June 20th, we had the all-party meeting where the Prime Minister had addressed the all-party meeting. Subsequently, the 15-point attention has been mentioned by the Prime Minister's office in relation to the situation in Ladakh. Number one is, of course, the Indian suggestion for going back to what it existed in April 2020. There is also the suggestion that the armed forces of India were given a free hand to discuss the operational issues. And there are other points in this. So the domestic political situation is more unified because it is related to sovereignty and territorial integrity of the country. And hence, despite some criticism on how to go ahead with this, some political parties have demanded military action in terms of a vertical or a horizontal escalation. Some political parties have asked for negotiations, discussions further. Whatever be that, there is a political consensus within the country on addressing this issue. The all-party meeting has resulted in that, and the defense minister's speech in the parliament regarding the position paper that has been laid out on the situation in Ladakh also reflected to those political issues domestically in India. The second part that you mentioned on zero-sum game, the South China Sea, there has been an Indian position on this, and India had kept away from conducting military exercises despite Obama-Modi joint vision statement in 2015 and subsequently with the activation of the Quad and the Malabar exercises. There has not been any Indian military exercise in South China Sea. Of course, there is a permanent court of arbitration ruling in July 2016 on this issue. And India had stated that the sovereignty issue has to be resolved by the concerned countries. For example, between China, Vietnam, China, Philippines, China, Malaysia, or other contestants. But in relation to the code of conduct, India has some 55% of its trade passing through the South China Sea, and hence India's national interests are also involved in the South China Sea. And hence there is the interest that India has in this. As of now, this has not become a precipitating point between China and India. So I do not think this is a zero-sum game at the moment between China and India. On Sudan and other areas also, I wanted to remind in 2005-06, we have had an energy cooperation agreement with China in which we actually had a swap. If the Chinese are drilling in Sudan, we would distribute those energy resources. So we have had a division of labor in terms of the energy and energy cooperation. Of course, the Galwan incident and the standoff in the border had vitiated the bilateral relations, and that is where the current efforts are focused on. For instance, we have not had any discussion between India and China other than the border dispute. In the Moscow meeting between the defense ministers and the foreign ministers, the issue is on the border. In the BRICS meeting, in the SEO meeting, online meetings, of course, the issues were related to COVID-19, economic recovery, and other things. However, we did not see Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping exchanging pleasantries, even online. So that resulted in the speculation about the impact of the border issue in the bilateral relations.
Thank you, Professor.
Simi, if I may,
Yes. So you were
ask a
just.
question. Oh no, okay, go ahead, finish. Yeah, I was going to ask Srikanth the question, but.
So basically, if you would like to complete what you were saying, because we lost you for a bit.
Oh yeah, I'm so sorry about that. Yes.
Briefly, so that we can have Professor Zhou's response to the South China Sea as well.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I'd almost finished my comments on the BRI to say that it's very strategic for China to have the BRI because of its worries, its existential worries about its trade passing through the South China Sea and the East China Sea and the Malacca Straits. And so I don't see China reducing its commitment to CPEC in the least from that point of view. I mean, there are various strategic pipelines for China, they're through Central Asia, through Kunming in Myanmar and so on. But this is a very key one, the Pakistan one. And the question I had really was, to what extent is India going to be able to live with that and adjust for it? Or is it going to be a permanent thorn in the side of the two countries' relationships? I mean, that was one question for Srikanth. The other question, Srikanth, is, you said all the parties united in the June all-party meet on the issue. The question is, 6 months have passed. Is there any frustration about the lack of progress among these parties, particularly the opposition parties, on the lack of progress? I mean, is it frustration directed at the Modi government? What's the situation on the ground?
Can I reply immediately?
Professor? Yes.
Yeah.
If you could be brief.
Thanks, Rafiq. I think there is indeed some frustration, but since the issue is a national issue, and this has been left to the armed forces and the 8 core commander level meetings, India is looking for the resolution at this level, institutional level. We have had in the last 2 to 3 decades, the confidence building measures, specific measures to deal with such situations. So at the moment, India is trying to address this from an institutional mechanism, the CBM's mechanism, as evolved in 93 or 96 or in 2012, the mechanisms. So if these mechanisms are not able to resolve the issue, and then it goes to the next level, we do not know what the next level is. At least I do not know the next level is. But the all-party meeting also suggested to the armed forces to resolve in the best way that they think this can be resolved. It is true that there are some opposition parties which have expressed concern on the slow progress or no progress in the 8 or 9 month standoff as of now. And some called for, as I mentioned before, escalation. in terms of forcibly vacating the lands that China occupied. That is one option that has been suggested by some political parties. But this has to be, of course, addressed by the armed forces, not by the opposition parties. And then you also have to consider various other things that the Indian state has to look at. So at the moment, this is now left to the institutional mechanism to address this issue.
Sure. Thank you, Professor.
And I had a question for you on whether India will live with CPEC or what can it do about that?
India's objection is mainly to the investments in Gilgit-Baltistan and POK. It has no view on whether China is investing in Gwadar, in Islamabad, in Karachi, or in other places. India's position is the Instrument of Accession signed in 1947, which provides for these lands to be part of the Indian concern. So when China had invested in these areas, the key problem there is the military nature of these. Of course, there are investments in hydroelectricity projects like Diama Basha Dam or across the Jhelum Neelam River or other such projects, mainly in the hydroelectricity. India's concern is number one in terms of the protection that China is making for these projects. As you know, this is a turbulent area. It is also with terrorism incidents. And so the deployment pattern of China, the 36,000 security guards that they deployed in this area, that is the concern for India. This has been raised at the highest levels, so which means that this is a concern that has been directly expressed to the Chinese side. Number two, when Pakistan decided to integrate Gilgit and Baltistan, China did not make any noise about it. And when they wanted to conduct elections, etc., in this region, China did not make any comments on this. So it appears that the Chinese position has been a condescending attitude in this, or even support to Pakistan. While when 370 article has been abrogated, China has been so strident in its opposition to a domestic legislation in India. So we saw the differential between China, Pakistan, China, India, and hence the Indian opposition to China's position on the Gilgit-Baltistan and POK areas.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Dosani, do you have a question for Professor Zhou,
Yes.
or can I continue?
On the South China Sea, I was wondering,
Yes.
Professor Zhou, if
Yes.
you wanted to say anything.
Yes. First of all, a few words on Professor Dasani's comments. I do agree with you that this bilateral issue between China and India over the border should be left to China and India. Even if some people in the United States might want to help, and even if some people in India might prefer American involvement in a way, because eventually this won't happen. Even for India, this would make you lose face if you invite the United States to come in to make intervention or to make interference. On the Belt and Road Initiative, I very much agree to your comment. The Pakistani is actually beneficiary of this Belt and Road Initiative. Well, Belt and Road Initiative is the largest project in terms of infrastructure in human history. I would not say it's flawless, because it's a humble proposal, the largest developing country from the world. So how can it be perfect? But the intention is to make use of China's experience in China's reform and open up. We learn that through our own development, that building beautiful roads or building good, decent roads are necessary for your development. That is why China is spending so much effort in developing its, express train, so on and so forth. So this is China's contribution, and the fact that so many countries embrace this idea shows that this is a good idea. So this is not a trap. China won't spend billions of dollars to lay such a mega trap. How can you do that? This is not a charity, because China also wants to be mutually beneficial. And in terms of the question from Srikanth on South China Sea, what I want to say is, if you compare the media of China and India, you would find that very few Chinese media talk about the Indian Navy's patrolling or cruise in the Indian Ocean. We seldom talk about it. We mention it, and that's it. But when Indian media talk about Chinese Navy, well, first there are really too many voices with grudge, I would say, and they don't like China's base in Djibouti, and the Indian government, I believe, really have given some pressure to Sri Lankan government and the Maldives government for the possible connection in accepting Chinese ships, even docking at the harbor. But what I want to say is, in this issue, South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, there is no contradiction whatsoever at all. Let me mention one example. Indians nowadays talk about freedom of navigation, almost like the United States. But this is most ironic in that Indians' law actually, compared with China's law on freedom of navigation, is much more strident or harsh, I would say. Let me tell you why. India and China have a reservation for Article 298. That is same reservation for the same article in UNCLOS. But you talk about the freedom of navigation. And in your law, regarding the use of an exclusive economic zone, you have made it clear, unless and until the Indian government gives consent, no military exercises involving ammunition or explosives should be conducted in India's exclusive economic zone. And in China's law regarding exclusive economic zone, we do not have such regulations. So sometimes I wonder, when Indians are talking about the freedom of navigation, what do you mean really? Or in the worst case, are you talking about something in violation of your own national law? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zhou. Can we have a last 1 minute of final concluding remarks from each of the panelists? 1 minute each on the way forward. Just a minute each. Professor Kondapalli, we'll start with you.
Thank you very much. And I think this is a very useful session. Let me thank the organizers for this. I just wanted to say that if India and China are two rising countries, and we have seen in European history between France and England, between Germany and France, such have gone for hundreds of years, the 100-Year War or other incidents. Even the Samdurongchu incident in 1986-87 took nearly 6-7 years to resolve. So the situation in Ladakh is, of course, very critical for the bilateral relations. As Dr. Jaishankar mentioned on June 17th, when the June 15th incident took place, he said this will have serious consequences for the bilateral relations with the premeditated action by the Chinese troops. So in that context, it appears that we are in for a long haul, and it will also impact on the bilateral relations. We have already seen on the app ban, on the restrictions on the infrastructure investments, or on Confucius Institutes in India, or on other measures. So this will have an impact on the bilateral relations. I do hope that there is the scope for China and India to get back to normalcy, because as some Chinese commentators also mentioned, this is a barren land that is being occupied. So there is a chance for both countries to get back to the negotiating table and discuss these issues, because these are not seen as vital for both China and India. And so I think some good sense prevails on both sides' leaders.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Professor Zhou, over to you. A minute.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I do. Again, I want to say that your 4 minutes probably is wrong. this is not a premeditated action on the Chinese side, because there's no need for China to make use of its military strength to prevail over India at a time or even at any time. There's no need. Why should China do that? You see, if you look at the border, we believe in the eastern section, you have gained a lot. And why most of the accidents or incidents happen in the western section and seldom in the eastern section? If we want to give you trouble, we could do it in the eastern section too, right? And why it's always in the western section? Because in the western section, China has more control of the territory, and that is, I believe, at least among Chinese audience or China's domestic audience, that India would want to get whatever it hasn't get, and would like to keep what it has already got. So this is very much an opinion in Chinese media. But I do agree with you that both sides should think about how to de-conflict, because this incident, which is deadly, really provide a chance for the two countries to think about this, how in the future we might change such things from happening again, or above this, how should we look at the whole relationship? The context has changed, the basis has changed. This is deadly. Everybody's surprised. So we should have some new momentum. Right now, people probably are still thinking because of the massive standoff is still there. But the thinking has started, I believe, on both sides. Or should we change our policy, our decades-old policy? And finally, you believe that this small pocket of territory may not matter that much. But I would like to quote Thucydides. What matters, or what caused the war? It's not a Thucydides trap, a term coined by Graham Allison. What Thucydides has really said is honor, fear, and interest. These three factors really trigger war. So along the border action control, what do we have? Two countries all have honor, have interest, or maybe some kind of fear. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zhou. Professor Dosani, over to you. Before we
That was
wrap
a
up.
very,
Yes.
very nice wrap up by both Srikanth and Professor Zhou. It's hard to do better than that, other than to say that, if India and China cooperate, there are very few problems that cannot be solved in the Asia-Pacific region. If they don't cooperate, there are very few problems that will be solved. So one hopes that wisdom will come and innovative thinking will come to resolve these issues. So that's back to you, Simi.
Thank you so much. So we now move to the concluding session, and we have short by 10 minutes. Apologies for that. So thank you to all the panelists for engaging so constructively, putting your perspectives on the table, and also candidly providing a policy direction towards making peace in the Sino-Indian relations, and also shedding some light on the interplay of America's own geopolitical interests in the region. So I think such discussions and interactions are very important way to maintain peace, long-term peace along the border, and also resume the ties. So thank you so much. I invite Dr. Arjun Kumar, Director of IMPRI, to propose the formal vote of thanks. Over to you, Arjun.
Thank you, Dr. Mehta. And it has been a very a delight this morning here from New Delhi, listening to all the experts. So let me propose the formal vote of thanks. I am honored to have been educated by a distinguished panel, and it is my privilege to propose the vote of thanks. My gratitude to Professor Zhou, Professor Srikanth Kondapalli, and Professor Rafiq Dosani for your informative insights. I thank Ms. Dong Ting for joining the panel discussion. I thank Ms. Jane Gordon from RAND Center for the Asia Pacific Policy and Team IMPRI Impact and Policy Research Institute for working on this together to make the panel discussion a success. I thank everyone in the audience who joined us this evening based on our time zones. I hope you enjoyed and gained from the experts' insight as well as for asking the questions in the real time. Thank you and stay safe. Have a good day.
Thank you so
Thank you for the
much.
great moderation, Simi. Good job.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you so much, Professor Zhou. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.